takes place. We fulfill the righteous requirements of the law. As we're loving God with all of our heart, with all of our soul, with all of our mind, and with all of our strength, and as we're loving our neighbor now as ourselves, and we are bearing the fruit of the Spirit, which is, we just read them, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. As we're bearing the fruit of the Spirit as believers, we fulfill the first and the second tablets of the law. And we do it naturally, supernaturally. By walking according to the Spirit now, as the Spirit leads us, He will always lead us in obedience. He will always lead us on paths of righteousness for His name's sake. And so, as believers now, we can live a holy life. We can live a godly life. We can live a life of purity, a life of loving. And thus, we do this not in our own power, although now that we are believers, we do it naturally, supernaturally. And we fulfill the righteous requirements of the law. And see, it's not about striving to keep the law. That's not what it's about. It's not striving to keep rules and regulations in our own strength or our own ability. But it's supernaturally done by the Spirit's power, as we are yielded daily to the Holy Spirit, as we're led and we're walking now according to the Spirit. Thus the prophecy in Jeremiah chapter 31 verse 33 is fulfilled in every should be fulfilled in every born-again, Spirit-filled believer. And here's what it says: I will put my laws in their mind and write them on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. Now let's continue on. He says in verse 5, and we'll read a bigger section now, and then we'll kind of come back and talk about it. But let me just say this before we do. This next little section shows us two opposite or opposing ways to live life. And what we're going to see in this next little section is the incredible contrast and the difference and the consequences and the results of walking according to the flesh versus walking according to the Spirit. What walking according to the flesh will bring versus walking according to the Spirit, and what that will bring into our lives. So let's begin looking at verse 5. He says, for those who live according to the flesh set their minds on the things of the flesh. But those who live according to the Spirit, the things of the Spirit. For to be carnally minded is death, but to be spiritually minded is life and peace. Because the carnal mind is an enmity, or is enmity against God, for it is not subject to the law of God, nor indeed can it be. So then, those who are in the flesh cannot please God. But you are not in the flesh, but in the Spirit, if indeed the Spirit of God dwells in you. Now if anyone does not have the Spirit of Christ, he is not his, or he does not belong to him. Verse 10, and if Christ is in you, the body is dead because of sin, but the Spirit is life because of righteousness. But if the Spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead dwells in you, he who raised Christ from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies through his Spirit who dwells in you. Verse 12, therefore, brethren, we are debtors not to the flesh, to live according to the flesh. For if you live according to the flesh, you will die. But if by the Spirit you put to death the deeds of the body, you will live. For as many as are led by the Spirit of God, these are sons of God. Now we saw in Galatians chapter 5 what the flesh is all about. And what the flesh is all about is sin. It's ugly. It's those sinful desires that manifest in fallen human beings. that they live according to the flesh. And so here in verse 5, what we learn, listen again, for those who live according to the flesh set their minds on the things of the flesh. But those who live according to the Spirit, the things of the Spirit. Now, Paul is contrasting two mindsets or two lifestyles. He says those who live according to the flesh, he said their minds are on the things of the flesh. Can you remember as an unbeliever? That's exactly how we lived. Our minds were consumed by and desirous for the things of the flesh, to satisfy the flesh's lusts, cravings, and desires. So we were ruled by the flesh. We were in pursuit of everything that the flesh craved. And the flesh craves to be satisfied by sinful actions and sinful behaviors. The flesh desires sexual sin, adultery, fornication, and we see the other myriad of sexual sins that are so gloried in and pushed in our culture today as being normal. That's all the flesh. The United States is a fleshly nation now. And that's why it's being pushed the way it is. But we see the flesh desires, and it's manifested in so many different ways, in drunkenness, in lying and stealing. The list is long. But that's how the people of the world live. That's how they walk. They live according to the flesh, according to their desires that are lusting or in contrast to God. And so the reason that they're living like that is because they don't have the Holy Spirit ruling. They're ruled by the flesh instead. And so it really does describe all of us BC. A mind that was controlled by fleshly desires, fleshly thinking. And the reason that that happened is because way back in the Garden of Eden, when Adam and Eve were being tempted to sin, and they yielded to that temptation, something took place within the human being, within the human race, that causes us now to live in a very carnal fashion. Because when God created us, if I can use a finger illustration, God created us spirit, soul, and body. And God created us to be in relationship with Him, to be connected spiritually. But when Adam and Eve sinned, they died spiritually. And so this flipped. And instead of spirit, soul, and body, the fleshly desires began to rule. And so we're born this way. And until we're born again, when we're born again, this is what will happen. We will be reconnected spiritually to the Lord. And so until that happens, we're walking according to the flesh and its desires. The lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, the pride of life. Fleshly things are the things that we crave, the things that we desire, that we look to satisfy. So, when a person then is born again, and the Holy Spirit begins to rule now, the flesh is no longer ruling, but now the Spirit is ruling. That person that is ruled by the Spirit is going to have his mind set on the things of the Spirit, that the Spirit desires. Before, his mind was set on the things that the flesh desired. And so his desires now become, as a Christian, as a born again, the Spirit of God living in us, his mind now begins to crave and desire the things that are spiritual. And he can respond to spiritual things because the Spirit is in control over his soul and his flesh. So it's all about rule. It's all about lordship. It's a mindset. What is your mind set on? Is your mind set on the flesh? Or is your mind set on the Spirit? See, who's ruling? Who's the Lord of your life? Look at verse 6. He says, for to be carnally minded is death, but to be spiritually minded is life and peace. You know, the wages of sin has never changed. It's always been the same ever since the beginning. When Adam and Eve were tempted, God had said to them, if you partake of this tree, you will surely what? Die. So the wages of sin has never changed. It's always been dead. And so he says to be carnally minded, to be fleshly minded, is death. Sin always leads to the same dead end. Carnally, worldly, fleshly people living for materialism and living for the flesh have as an ending a death sentence. But to be spiritually minded, Paul says here, is life and peace. See, they're extreme opposites. And there's always two roads in this world that we can walk on. We're either walking on the road of spiritual pursuits, having our minds set on things above, not on earthly things, or we are walking to please the flesh, and our pursuits are worldly, and a person that is carnally minded, and that leads to death. So when you look at this verse, the way Paul describes the opposite here, verse 6, to be carnally minded is death, but to be spiritually minded is life and peace. Which category are you living in right now? Then we go on in verse 7 and he says, because the carnal mind is enmity against God. For it is not subject to the law of God, nor indeed can be. You know, it's funny because people, you can pretty much tell pretty quickly when you talk to people, if you start talking to them about spiritual things, if they do this, and they begin angry at the things of God, they start to get mad about the Bible or about Jesus, you know they're carnally minded. They don't want to have anything to do with God. They're in enmity against God. And so they're not subject to God. They don't want to be subject to the law of God or any of that. Nor can they be. They're powerless to do it. And so that's what Paul is pointing out. There's two different lives or lifestyles or ways to live this life. So verse 8 he says, so then, those who are in the flesh cannot please God. So he's basically saying, if you're not a Christian, you're not born again of the Spirit, and you're still in the flesh, you're still controlled by the flesh, you're still ruled by the flesh, that your desires are carnal and worldly, he said those who are in the flesh cannot please God. It's impossible. Now it's interesting because